If you've been on a trip to Europe recently, you've probably noticed Americans literally everywhere. You often hear English in the dulcet American accent more than the actual native tongue of the country that you're visiting.
Thank you so much, sir. Good morning, Junior. Ha, what a guy.
And if you're wondering why, you wouldn't be alone. Not only is the US dollar stronger than it's ever been before and destroying other currencies for breakfast, but Americans are richer than ever before when compared to Europeans.
Do you think Europe's got any future?
Well, I've often wondered if Europe wants a future.
And where better to flex that wealth gap than in Europe's only world-beating economic sector, tourism. Not only is Europe falling way behind on technology compared to the US, but it's also falling behind massively in terms of productivity. And because of that, its citizens are paid far less than Americans for the same role. A recent post on Twitter went viral showing how much a nuclear scientist is paid within the UK. At £65,000 for the most senior of nuclear engineers, or around $80,000, Americans were quick to point out that that kind of a salary could be made by many McDonald's workers in the United States, and certainly by nuclear engineers, which is obviously a very skilled profession.
In the event of a meltdown, push this button and only this button.
Ooh, it's time.
Simpson,
What?
you see which button I'm pushing?
Yeah. Push the button. Got it.
Some users even pointed out that janitors at nuclear power stations probably make excess of $100,000. But I've also seen a lot of pushback from Europeans who basically say, well, we don't want to work more. We don't care about getting paid more. We just want to relax with the extra time that we have from economic productivity. Today, I want to explain why I think that is kind of just cope and it's not a viable long-term solution for Europe, what Europe is trying to do to solve this problem, and also what it means economically for young people in Europe and what can be done about it. Let's start off with why Europe is falling behind economically in the first place. Isabel Schnabel from the ECB, the European Central Bank, placed the blame at the feet of a failure by European companies to adopt new technologies like cloud computing or other software applications. And the problem wasn't that this technology isn't available in Europe, it's that very few companies actually tend to use it. Why? Well, there's actually way more small businesses in Europe than in the US. In the US, 60% of people are employed by a company that has 250 employees or more. Whereas in Greece, for example, that falls to 13%, or in Germany, it falls to the 30s. When you're a small business, it's a lot harder to invest in things like software developers, to build software applications of your own, or project managers to actually manage them, and so on. But not only that, the European companies have to deal with a huge amount of regulation surrounding technology that American ones pretty much don't have to, at least when they're domestically focused. Once the American firms can expand internationally and they're massive and they have huge amounts of cash, they can easily comply with European regulations and take over the European market from within. Europe is basically shooting itself in the legs with a machine gun when it comes to regulation, in my opinion. And when you actually look at the numbers, you can see that if Europe's top 5 economies, the UK, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, had kept up with the US when it comes to productivity, from 1995 to 2022, we would have $13,000 per person more in GDP per person. For all of the talk about people saying we don't have enough money to fund the NHS, the UK's National Health Service, imagine what we could do had we 20% more GDP per person. The NHS would easily be funded. And that brings me back to why Europeans can't just sit back, relax, and enjoy the decline whilst working less hours and not really caring about making more money, making their countries more productive. It's because there's a giant demographic crisis that's on the way and it's just around the corner. People just can't see it yet necessarily. Europe has been struck by protest after protest over the last few years as various European governments have announced plans to increase their retirement ages. It's simply unaffordable for many governments to basically pay out generous pension handouts at the same age when there's increasingly more and more older people and increasingly less young people to pay for it. So what's it going to be? Do you want to sit back and relax, or do you want to retire on time? If so, then you need to improve the productivity of the European economy. When you look at the scale of the demographic decline in Europe, it's actually pretty nuts. As soon as 2030, in only 6 years, guys, there will be 3.4 million less working age people in Germany. And that's not even taking into consideration the fact that the retirement age population will have increased. By 2050, in the EU, there will be 1 retiree for every 2 working age people. That means that every couple will effectively have to pay taxes to support the pension of an older person. Not to mention, if they have kids, they'll have to pay for those as well, obviously. In the US, that's not as bad. The ratio is 3-to-1, which isn't the best, but it's a lot better. As a side note, I don't think this would actually ever happen, but imagine if the EU or maybe the UK agreed some kind of an immigration deal with the US that allowed people from either country to work in the other country, similar to how EU countries can currently allow their own citizens to work in any of the other EU countries. It would actually be the nail in the coffin for Europe. There would be so many young people that would leave Europe in search of a better life, the American dream effectively. They would effectively double or triple their salaries for doing the exact same job. And Europe would be left with the brain drain magnitudes above what it is already facing. Not to mention a tax drain. It's not only that Europe is losing its working age population, but its existing working age population wants to work far less hours. And that's leading to huge labor shortages. For example, the average European worker works 5 less hours per quarter than the pre-pandemic trend. And in Germany, that's not necessarily only because people want to work less hours, but also because the government is mandating that people work less hours. They've passed a law to prevent workers from working more than 48 hours per week. Companies that don't police their employees and ensure they aren't going above that can get in serious hot water with the government. It's no wonder then that Germany has the least hours worked per person per year in the entirety of the advanced economies of the world, the OECD. With this level of worker shortages, someone has to do the job, and many governments have turned to mass immigration as the solution for the problem. And it's really not a panacea and has caused other issues. The far right is rising throughout all of Europe, and the political tensions are at boiling point, in my opinion. So I don't think it's a long-term solution. One of the main culprits here to blame for the economic malaise is the welfare state. It's hugely expensive to pay for, and it means that governments have to tax their working age citizens hugely in order to pay for it. That disincentivizes working more hours because you're just going to have to pay higher rates of tax on it. And it also means that people who would be in low paid income end up just staying on benefits instead because there's no incentive to actually get a job when you're only going to be paid a little bit more and you'll be taxed on that anyway. I'm not alone in thinking this. Germany has joined the UK and the Netherlands in attempting to penalize people who work more hours less by reducing their taxes. Their finance minister has come up with a plan which involves taxing people who work overtime over 41 hours per week less and giving them a tax break. However, the unions do oppose this idea, so to be honest, the power of the unions in Germany is so strong that it's unlikely to go through. But the idea is there at the very least. Something that I think would be really useful to encourage people to work more hours, in the UK at least, would be to massively increase the number of tax bands and lower the jumps in rate between them. Right now, it's pretty penalizing when you're earning just below the tax threshold rate and then you go above it. For example, if you earn below £50,000 and then you go above that, any income that you earn above that is taxed at 40%, whereas below it, you're taxed at 20%, a 20% jump. In the US, for example, they have 7 different federal income tax rates, and the jumps between them range from 5%, 2%, 3% or 10% for one of them. But I also think it's really important that Europeans don't just put their heads in the sand and say, well, we don't need economic growth. We don't need to be rich like the Americans. We can just relax and enjoy our time. Because at the end of the day, somebody has to pay for the welfare state and the pensions of old people if people want to retire at a reasonable age. I really worry for the future of young people in Europe over the coming decades. As they're set to decrease as a share of the population, it means they also have far less voting power compared to pensioners. The pension system will not get reformed because of the number of old people as a voting bloc whilst the number of young people working as a voting bloc will continue to decrease. That means that young people are likely to face more and more taxes and not even face any level of economic growth to increase their salaries. So how is it going to get better? I personally don't see any way. Europe needs absolutely huge reforms in order to put it in the right direction, and I just don't see the political will for that to actually happen at the moment. If you're a young European, I would genuinely encourage you to consider leaving the continent and going somewhere that would appreciate your talents more by paying you more and taxing you less. And I do realize this is a really depressing take if you're European, but I genuinely don't see any chance of it improving or any kind of bright spots. So if you do, please let me know in the comments below, because I'm in need of a pick-me-up after this video. If you want to learn more about how Europe is also falling behind on technology when it comes to AI and other innovations, then please watch the video here. If you like the video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.